What I wanted to do today was a couple of things. One is I'm excited to be here to tell you about IxProbe. I'll actually pass one around a little bit later today, and kind of go through that and hopefully give you an overview and some of the use cases. But where I wanted to start with is just a little bit of kind of understanding and context of who Ixia and Keysight are. I think it will give you sort of our point of view and where maybe the sort of networking ecosystem or value chain we play. And then, so I'll talk generally a little bit, but what I want to do is while I think IxProbe will apply to a lot of cases, namely around edge networking, I'll spend most of the time on specific use case just by way of conversation and sort of demonstration. So obviously stop me if you have any questions. So how many of you are familiar with Ixia? Raise your hands. Wow, almost everybody. And Keysight? Wow, almost everybody. I think by the end you'll see, oh yeah, I do know who you're talking about with Keysight, but there's been some name changes. So I'll start with that. Ixia is as the name says here, a Keysight business. We've been around for about 20 years, so there's really kind of two key parts of the business. There's a network test part of the business, network visibility. The roots really were on the network test side, as Tom was saying a moment ago, 20 years of sort of trying to be on the cutting edge to make sure that our customers are able to deliver the next greatest thing before it's even out on the market. So obviously that's been a challenge, but a proud legacy we have. On the network test side of the business, I won't spend too much time there because it sounds like most of you understand it and know what we do there. But if you think about all of the switches and routers and Wi-Fi access points and maybe firewalls or IDSs, IPSs, whatever the case may be, if there's network equipment going in to create a network, then we're going to be there helping to test it and make sure it runs right. So think of it in working with network equipment manufacturers to be on sort of the design, development, QA before they roll it out to their customers. And then on the service provider and enterprise side, a lot of times what they'll use our gear for is for maybe vendor bake-offs, make sure the performance is better or worse for the applications that they're doing. Or obviously if your network's critical in the case of service providers and some of these big enterprises, then they'll use us to test whole network systems and make sure it's going to perform the way it should. And you know, an example of that would be on the security side, right? We have a very developed threat intelligence capability where we can make sure everything from kind of A/B cyber gaming to making sure that it blocks and deals with, and you can triage and expected times for DDoS attacks or whatever the case might be. So wide range of capabilities on the network test side. All of that tends to be obviously by definition mostly pre-deployment. On the production side of networks is the network visibility part of our business. You know, the way to think about that is we help enable companies, you know, service providers, enterprises. If you hear me say enterprises, I basically put everything into that category that's not service providers. So government, financials, healthcare, everything is enterprise bucket. But we help them essentially make sure that their networks are performing, they're delivering applications to the specs that need to ensure the end customer experience, obviously, and what their customers demand, and also do that securely. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So that's Ixia. We have about 6,000 customers worldwide, proud of the leadership positions we hold. I won't spend any time here. I've kind of already alluded that we serve the network equipment manufacturers, most all of them, largest service providers and enterprises. Now, Keysight is interesting. So Keysight actually, you know, if you think about the quintessential, and I guess in this case actually not a quintessential, but the quintessential garage startup, right, with Hewlett and Packard in the garage creating this measurement device that I think at the time actually used vacuum tube technology, if I remember correctly. You know, that was the startup. That's what they based the whole company on. Obviously, that grew over the years into HP. HP became very large in a lot of different businesses, and they spun out, sorry about that, they spun out into Agilent Technologies, so kind of carried that core test and measurement capabilities there. You might recognize that name a little bit more. I see a few heads nodding. And then in 2014, basically they took a lot of the life sciences capabilities of Agilent, kept that as Agilent, and spun off that same core test and measurement legacy into Keysight Technologies. And then Keysight more recently bought Ixia in 2017, and really a lot of the drivers were strategic in terms of diversifying the test and measurement, right? So bringing the network capability, at least in a larger way than what Keysight did before, but a lot of it was also about the software capabilities, and then more specifically kind of moving not just sort of that physical layer, as great as they are at it, but also to those layers 4 through 7 as well, or really 2 through 7 in the case of Keysight. So that's who we are. That's kind of what we're about, and then obviously kind of together it's that full tilt test and measurement capability all the way from sort of chip design and manufacture to obviously the latest in networking with all the way over there to cloud on the side. So what I wanted to do was maybe just to spend a couple minutes, and I'll keep narrowing down to not be quite as general here in the near future, but on the network visibility part of the business, since that's where sort of IxProbe resides, I wanted to give it a little better idea of what we do there. And the way I like to think about that is really that we do sort of a software-defined abstraction for customers it does all the work for them, all the kind of work and connections they have to do to get visibility, all the various parts of their network, and we just sort of drew one up there. Obviously, it can get more complicated, and that's just representative. But essentially, at the end of the day, making sure that they're able to help their customers ensure performance, and then not just ensure performance, but obviously if something goes wrong, very quickly get to the root problem and solve it and fix it. And so what I wanted to do is just give you a couple of specific examples around that, some simple, some more complicated. But if I take this example here, on the left side, just sort of representing a data center, and the first kind of fundamental step is just getting access in a very literal way to what's going on in the network. Literally, as the name implies, tapping into the network. And that could be everything from inline to out of band. It could be sort of physical and virtual networks, on-premise in the cloud. It doesn't really matter. We have the capability to make sure that in any given point they want to have access to, and sort of the network topology, if you will, then we can make sure they can get information from what's going on there over to the rest of their monitoring tools. And so you see on the far right is kind of where we're headed, and the top at the other slide, which is basically all the different technical partners doing everything from network performance monitoring, application performance monitoring, security of all types, again, both inline and sort of passive or out of band. But what we'll do a lot of times is bring that information then to what we call our network packet broker line, our Vision series. That's the series that, as Tom alluded to before, we presented on before at Network Field Day. And then what that actually looks like, and I'll just start with some simple examples and maybe a little more complex, but at the end of the day, really, some of it is very simple, but it makes a big difference in how they optimize their monitoring architecture. So what we'll see a lot of times is people just fundamentally, they'll have, let's say, 1 gig tools, right? And trying to deal with 10 gig links, or call it 10 gig tools now, and dealing with 100 gig links, whatever the case may be. And then obviously those investments are very expensive. And so they may have multiple 1 gig links that they want to kind of combine and go into a 10 gig tool. They may have a 100 gig link that they want to just filter out certain things, or maybe load balance against multiple tools. And then that's kind of the simple pieces, so kind of a many to one and one to many visibility. And then more complicated, and I think more interesting, and you'll continue to see us kind of roll out more capabilities with sort of the level of intelligence we're able to produce on top of that, or some of the complexity that needs to be done. Obviously, a ton of the traffic today, and I think even more in the future, will be sort of encrypted, and so a lot of the tools can't handle that. And maybe the analytics that they're trying to do above and beyond sort of the regular monitoring tools, and so we'll do SSL decryption, we'll enrich NetFlow, application ID and filtering, geolocation and device sort of information, and so on and so forth. So a lot of capabilities to do there, but again, at the end of the day, trying to get the right data at the right time and the right condition to the various tools and analytic capabilities that customers are trying to use. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. All right. So where I'm going to spend a little bit more time then is sort of around what we call kind of our edge set of products, and again, more specifically IxProbe, and more specific to that, as the name of the presentation implied, a use case with managed network service providers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to talk about all the big buzzwords and 5G and edge and virtual and all that kind of stuff. I'll reference them, obviously, but the really only point here is I've been a part of a lot of different conversations, obviously, about what edge is and what edge isn't, and clearly it means different things to different people. And I've heard everything from like edge is going to eat the cloud to that's silly, we'll just put another cloud at the edge, to hey, that's what CDNs have been doing for years, so why are we talking about this, right? But at the end of the day, the point is that clearly there's sort of the digital world meeting the physical world, And as you meet that kind of people, place, and things, there's some things that have to happen and keep the data there and do the compute and processing more localized. And so we've been trying to think about what does that mean for a lot of the challenges. And funny enough, it looks a lot of similar ones that we solve today on the visibility side of the business, but everything from just operationally, how do you deal with those things? How do you track and manage the assets? How do you secure them? Again, fundamentally, how do you get visibility to those pieces? Because as I'll describe today, as simple as it may be, it creates a lot of blind spots. So generally, for example, we presented on the Vision E1S, I think last time that we presented at Network Field Day. I'm not going to go through all of these. The point is kind of based on our Hawkeye software platform and various endpoints like what the IxProbe is, we've developed and continue to enhance some of the products that will help customers get the same visibility that I've been talking about now in sort of edge conditions and a large range of type of use cases. So where I want to spend most of the time, though, is just, again, kind of narrowing the focus. I think there's a lot of applications in both service providers and enterprise, but I want to look specifically at managed network service providers. And what we see is obviously a lot of change. And again, I want to avoid kind of all the buzzwords, but maybe really focus on three kind of key concepts that I think are driving some of the change, at least around the use case that I'm describing today. Not mutually exclusive by any means, but I think one fundamental change that we're seeing from the technology side for service providers is kind of this movement we have there at the top of the slide where, previously kind of these direct links, MPLS, maybe hub and spoke WANs, but that's fundamentally changing now to be more IP-centric. I think there's a lot of different drivers that's causing that. Obviously capabilities like SD-WAN enable new ability to use IP for that sort of connections, and virtualization cloud have kind of commoditized some of those pieces. So that's kind of a big technology difference that service providers are seeing, overlapping and partially driven by each other. From a business perspective, for years they're able to essentially monetize the infrastructure, right? They make these big investments. They amortize that over 3 to 5 years, or maybe longer, depending on what part of the network, if you will, that we're talking about. And they made good money off of that, and they're providing a good service. What they're seeing today, and we're finding today, is that that's not good enough anymore. You got to provide the infrastructure. In some cases, maybe it's just a connection to the infrastructure, but it's the services that they can do over that really is sort of generating the revenue. And then the third bucket that I want to talk about is enterprises fundamentally. And I say enterprises, you'll probably hear me a lot today talk about like a retail example or whatever, but really I mean kind of these large multi-branch enterprises that have a regionally distributed, maybe global, but certainly kind of across the nation type of footprint for various reasons. And what you're seeing, obviously they're challenged from again, this digital world, e-commerce, all the different interesting ways people are able to make transactions and have goods and services delivered to them and sort of interact with the world is challenging what they do. And so they're getting more creative with what experiences and kind of things that they offer customers that either come in their store or interact with them in various ways, ranging from loyalty programs, in-store advertising. We hear a lot about different AR and VR type capabilities, and even security, both real physical security as well as the typical cybersecurity that we're talking about. It's interesting to me and surprising in some ways. I was talking to somebody the other day, and it's like literally you cannot buy a chicken from Boston Market if they don't have an IP connection. Like literally you can't do it. You can't offer them cash. You can't walk out of the store with a chicken if they don't have that IP connection, which again, I don't know what the other topics you guys were talking about earlier today, and we're kind of talking about a simple IP connection, and that's about as deep as we're going to go, frankly, today. But it's incredible, right? So just fundamentally, even the point of sale system is incredibly important to enterprises today. And what that's driving, then kind of moving back up to the other bullets, from a service provider standpoint, is a differential need for higher level SLAs, even in the case we'll talk about today, being able to measure the SLAs, end-to-end support, and then actually offering some of these services as services that they can provision to the enterprises that they work with. So the question then is that a big opportunity or a big risk? And obviously I'm asking it because it's both, clearly. And the way I sort of, from a project management standpoint, we're launching IxProbe this week, so I probably have IxProbe on the brain and everything. Maybe it looks like some version of it. But I was in London a couple of weeks ago, and I actually grew up in West Texas, and I've always been in Texas. And so coming into even, in my adult life, before I really saw these kind of mass transit systems, right? And so this is a picture of the London train system, the underground, largely rails. And it's an amazingly complex system to do a very simple task, right? Which is to move people from one place to another, but it becomes essentially the lifeblood of the city, right? And it was interesting while I was there because I started to hear this phrase and see this sign everywhere I was, mind the gap. 3 little words. And I was amazed. It's like literally, I thought maybe it was like just this particular rail station that I was on or whatever. It was literally the whole time I was there, and I see a couple of nodding heads because you guys have experienced that too. So in the bottom right there, it's on the doors, and there's different permutations of minding the gap, whether it's physical. And then really what they're talking about though, essentially, is this little space here, right? That you go from the platform to the train to be transported somewhere else. And I did a little bit looking into it. So it actually started in 1968. It was a little bit interesting because those 3 gaps were the simple solution because it was actually, they got to a point where it was too big where the train engineers and the platform kind of attendants couldn't actually be sitting there minding everybody, right? Like telling them back off, mind the gap. It just wasn't working. And so they actually had solid state, capabilities at the time. And so you had to have a really short phrase. And so mind the gap became that phrase. So it's a very simple solution to actually what is a simple problem to make sure that, gosh, heaven forbid that it's a physical, like somebody gets stuck and there's a physical problem or somebody gets hurt, but even just delaying one of those trains, right? Something simple as that, it kind of backs up the whole system. And so this phrase of minding the gap became one that made me think a lot about sort of the service, the use case that we're talking about here. So if you imagine these retail chains, I've used retail as an example there. Depends on how you define it a little bit, but let's call it 4 million different sites. Some of them have hundreds of thousands of sites. Some of them have 10,000s, thousands, but we're talking about large scale. And we're talking about everything from, let's say all the Taco Bells that people eat at. Anybody like Taco Bell? Or am I alone in that? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. All right. So there's a few people who admit it. All right. That's good. I like Taco Bell. So you got Taco Bell to Cigna, for example, is a healthcare company where they have their support distributed all over the nation out of their homes. Right? And you'll see why that matters here in a moment. But the point is that a given provider, kind of represented here in the red, is going to have a certain footprint, right? They're going to own that last mile to provide that connectivity in those areas. But the customers that they are trying to sign up to these enterprise-wide deals, right? Maybe, again, at least nationally, maybe globally, have a different footprint represented by the green there. And then, of course, if you kind of do just the simple subtraction, you're left with the blue, which are all the areas they can't cover, right? So clearly they're not going to say, well, sorry, we're out. We can't provide that to you. Clearly they do these peering agreements to make sure that happens, where essentially they're already losing a little bit of money, or there's a money exchange to be able to provide that for each other, essentially. But what that creates then is this interesting situation where in all those sites that you see there in blue, they have a gap. It's dead space. You've got the last mile being provided by the provider on one side, you got the customer's network on the other, and they literally can't see what's going on. And the problem that you run into is extreme operating costs for them to deal with it when something goes wrong. Somebody calls and says, I've got a problem. Taco Bell calls, and they don't know if it's a problem with Taco Bell's enterprise network. They don't know if it's, let's say, AT&T was providing that last mile. In this case, they don't know if it's something on AT&T side. And literally, they will send a truck out. In the case of an optic link, they'll send a truck out. Somebody will come out there. They'll plug in their tool. They'll see that light's flowing. And it's like, okay, that's the first problem-solving step.
So this is definitely a real challenge. I spent a lot of time in retail enterprise before I became a consultant, and I think we had one connection for retail in New York that took us 8 months to troubleshoot because the ILEC in New York would not talk to the team that was handling the enterprise connections, and they just kept sending people back and forth. And it was, so what you're describing is definitely a significant challenge for retail.
Yeah, and it's expensive. So if we kind of talk about some of those impacts, then these truck rolls that we're talking about average somewhere around $250 every time you send somebody out, you were saying how many times they probably had to send those out. And this
It
use
was like
case,
4 or 5 at least.
yeah, and then talking to the support folks, somewhere around 60 plus an hour when you kind of bake everything in. And if you're doing multiple calls over the course of 8 months, basically you can very quickly wipe out any profitability that you might have had, not to mention, of course, the mounting customer frustration. And so, and then long term, right, then fundamentally you're losing profits, you wipe that out for the year, and then there's the declining competitive advantage part of it. So the flip side of that, though, what we're finding with customers is that then they have a lot of ability to actually generate new revenue streams. So one of the customers we're working with today, one of them actually, as part of us being part of their offering, started offering these new tier service. We had another customer saying, look, I don't feel comfortable bidding on some of these deals because I don't have this capability. And so, like you were saying, it is a real problem. But fundamentally, they can not just improve the operating cost, but actually generate new revenue streams, which is something that I thought was pretty interesting. So the other interesting part I found is that there wasn't really a great solution to this. They had actually spent a while trying to figure this out, and because we were kind of close partners with them, we started saying, well, that seems like something that we can do and we can use. And part of the reason why there wasn't a lot of options, and I've tried to, there's never not any competition, of course. There are ways you can do it, but there's a few kind of specific characteristics about that I mentioned a while ago that really make the use case unique. Again, one is you don't have any visibility, you don't own any of the equipment, right? And even in areas where you do own part of the equipment in some cases and not in others, we're finding they want to see kind of a common way to monitor those. But so it needs to be inline. It needs to fail over. One of the things that we've done for years is bypass technology so that if you lose power or something goes wrong, it fails open and continues to let the network flow. And why that seems so simple, but it's important, is one of the customers we talked with, they had a problem. They were trying to triage this for months, but they would see the network go down somewhat intermittently, but somewhat regularly at the same roughly time period. And sometimes it would go down and stay down for a little while, and sometimes it would just be down for a bit and come back. And they spent a long time trying to figure out what it was. And finally, what they figured out was that in this location, and you got to picture some of these environments, right? It's not like a rack mount data center. It's a shelf in a manager's office or maybe a small rack or something like that. But what they were finding was the cleaning personnel would come through, need the plug, they'd unplug the gear, the network would go down, they'd vacuum or whatever, and then hopefully they remembered to plug it back in, right? And again, it sounds silly, but that was one of the key capabilities. The other kind of thing that you see is you're behind a NAT sometimes. You have to end up paying your peering partner for additional IP addresses that you can kind of talk to and ping, and so we've solved that with something we call inline adoption that I'll talk more about. And then, of course, you could actually do some of these things by instrumenting it heavily and so on and so forth, but that gets cost prohibitive, and again, maybe your customer doesn't want you to be in that part of the network.